Hello and welcome to Dialogue. Over the past few months, top U.S. officials have been traveling extensively to Southeast Asian nations in a clear 180-degree reversal in foreign policy. Compared to his predecessor, U.S. President Joe Biden seems to be placing greater importance on America's relations with Southeast Asia and on ASEAN as an essential part of the architecture of the Indo-Pacific region. Why the sudden change of heart? What do these visits tell us about Washington's Indo-Pacific strategy? And more importantly, what's the outcome of this rekindled diplomacy? To answer these questions, I'm joined by Dr. Zhao Hai, Research Fellow at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, Benoit Hardy Chartrand, Adjunct Professor for Political Science and International Affairs at Temple University in Japan, Robert Kelly, Professor at the Department of Political Science of Pusan National University, and later Professor Thintine Pangsudira, Director of the Institute of Security and International Studies and Faculty of Political Science at Chulalongkorn University. That's our topic. I'm Xu Qingduo. So welcome to the show, gentlemen. Since May and June, U.S. Deputy Secretary of State Wendy Sherman visited Indonesia, Cambodia, and Thailand. The U.S. has been sending top officials, including Defense Secretary Lord Austin, Secretary of State Antony Blinken, and a future visit by Vice President Kamala Harris to Southeast Asia. So, Robert, I will start with you. So, what is the purpose of this intensive engagement here?
Sure, I think it's twofold. I think the most obvious one, I think, is China and the Indo-Pacific, which is now sort of the American strategic focus, right? The Americans are beginning to seriously withdraw from the greater Middle East, Afghanistan being the most obvious marker, right? China really is the big foreign policy story for this administration, right? Russia is sort of a troublemaker, but it's really weak compared to China. China's rise continues, right? And the United States is now beginning to develop relationships all around China's periphery, right? I don't want to call it containment. I mean, that's a tough debate, right? But the United States wants to be involved in the region. And one place the U.S. is weak is in Southeast Asia. I would also add that Southeast Asia is sort of a good ally. This is not as much discussed, but Southeast Asia is also sort of a good partner for the United States in the larger war on terrorism, or what's left of the war on terrorism. Islam in Southeast Asia is much more moderate than in the Gulf. And it actually makes strategic sense for the United States to build relationships with moderate Muslim states in Southeast Asia, sort of as a hedge as the U.S. withdraws from the Middle East.
Mm-hmm. Well, Benoit, how do you see this? Some people will say U.S. is courting Southeast Asia. How does this U.S. policy on ASEAN fit in the big picture of U.S.-China policy?
Right. Well, I think this focus on Southeast Asia it certainly fits perfectly within the greater Indo-Pacific strategy. We've heard the Biden administration officials talk a lot more about ASEAN centrality over the last few months. They're really talking the Southeast Asian language there. For the administration in Washington, it's obvious that they wanted to show that Southeast Asia is a region of central importance. I mean, it is a region of 640 million people, a combined GDP of $3 trillion. And considering the advances that China has made over the last 4 years during the Trump administration as far as advancing its interests in the region, I think it was clear for the Biden administration that it needed to reassert its presence in the region. And this is what we're seeing with these recent visits by American officials to the region. And I don't think we are likely to see any changes over the next few years. It will continue to constitute a central piece of the U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy.
Mm-hmm. Well, not long ago, U.S. Defense Secretary Lord Austin said in Singapore in a visit last week, actually, we will not flinch when our interests are threatened, yet we do not seek confrontation. So, Zhao Hai, Secretary of the Defense saying that we do not seek confrontation. That's rather reconciliatory word, right? Or was he speaking to the ASEAN nations, or was he speaking to China?
Well, first of all, I think it's self-contradictory in a way that when he talked about not flinching, but at the same time talking about no confrontation. But first of all, these kind of visits to Southeast Asia by American top diplomats brings us back to the old days of the Obama administration. When they talk about pivot to Asia, we all remember back then they also have extensive visits by diplomats and try to develop the relations between the United States and Southeast Asia and also Asia as a whole. But back then it was much more positive when the U.S. trying to build economic relationship with the region. But right now the U.S. has no intention of returning to TPP or CPTPP right now, and then at the same time trying to increase military and security relations with the region with the clear intention of countering China. So I think the message here is quite negative overall, and I think when the Secretary of Defense talking about all this messaging in this region, it is quite confusing, I think, to the regional countries trying to conciliate or find a way to deal with both powers, the United States and China.
Mm-hmm. Well, Benoit, you mentioned about ASEAN centrality. U.S. also developed or I would say reinforced this concept or this mechanism, Quad with India, with Australia, with Japan. So, which is more important to the U.S., Quad or ASEAN?
Well, it's difficult to say which region is more important, but if we've seen the last 4 months, I think for the first few months of the Biden administration, the priority is mostly going to be placed on the Quad partners. We've seen certainly a reinforcement, a re-upping of the importance of the Quad partnership within the last 6 months, the first half of the year. And for the Biden administration, we've seen, for example, the First Leaders Summit early in the year. And given the increased importance of China, the centrality of China for the American foreign policy for the Biden administration, I think we're likely to see greater emphasis on the Quad, and we're likely to see more high-level meetings over the next few years. But that doesn't mean, of course, that the Southeast Asian region and ASEAN as a whole will take necessarily a back seat. We've seen already that with the recent visits to the region, that the region will continue to be a priority for the Biden administration. But I think overall, if we look at the greater strategic rivalry with China, I think it fits more in the American plans to put emphasis and priority on the Quad for the time being.
Mm-hmm. Well, Robert, obviously, U.S. has a China policy of, say, competition, confrontation, and cooperation. How this kind of policy is going to be conducted, like in ASEAN in this region?
Sure, I think the United States doesn't actually need to sort of charge headlong into a serious confrontation with China, right? The United States has some geopolitical advantages here, which is that it's very far away from China, and there are a lot of countries around China that don't want to be rolled over by China either. So the United States has the ability to sort of play hard to get and buck past to locals like Japan and India. So I would imagine that China's tensions will be more with local states than with the United States, and the Americans can sort of just afford to stand in the background, which is what I think the Biden people intend to do. Biden's not as brash as Donald Trump. He's not as annoying as Donald Trump. He's not going to sort of play the race card over COVID and China the way Donald Trump did. That's over, at least hopefully, for a while, right? And so the Biden people are going to be a lot more cautious, and there's just simply no reason why the United States shouldn't court Southeast Asia along with India and Japan and the others along China's periphery, just to sort of like stay in the background and sort of hold things together and make sure, again, that sort of China doesn't roll over the region, which is sort of America's big concern, of course. But I don't actually think the United States is in the position or needs to actually sort of provoke China. I actually think the United States has sort of, just like I said, sort of a geographic advantage in that it can just sort of stand back and sort of wait. And so in the interim, sure, I mean, why not go and talk to the ASEAN states and just sort of feel them out and see what they think about China and particularly the South China Sea.
Mm-hmm. Well, the U.S. official would say, we are not trying to pressure ASEAN nations to choose sides, either with China or with the U.S. But at the same time, you can say, I mean, the expectation from Washington is crystal clear, John Hai.
Well, it's not, from their rhetoric, it's not very clear because, first of all, Washington denied that they want a Cold War with China. And also, they don't want to pursue a confrontation with China. They just emphasize that there will be stiff competition with China. In Southeast Asia, if you consider the region is #1 trading partner with China and has very close relationship diplomatically and also on many other areas culturally, for instance. So it's very hard for the U.S. to drive a wedge between China and Southeast Asian countries and ASEAN as a whole. So I think at this point, what the U.S. is trying to do is to emphasize that their position as a counterweight to China's expansion in the region, because of course countries in the region have their worries about China's growing power. However, I think in many ways the U.S. is inserting instability in the region because sometimes it's hard to differentiate whether or not they want to play a peaceful and stability role, or they wanted to instigate some of the problems, for instance, in South China Sea, trying to have all those countries fight against China. So I think overall, the U.S. needs to be more careful about their policy in the region because they don't want to force those countries to choose sides, and those countries do not want to choose sides at this point.
Mm-hmm. Well, Robert, what do you say about the U.S. policy over South China Sea? There's opinion pieces, for example, in Thailand, I think Bangkok Post saying that the U.S. urges ASEAN to stand up to China. Basically, that's, confrontation or, more competition with China, right?
Yeah, sure, it is. I think South China Sea is the big flashpoint of the future between the U.S. and China, or to be more specific, U.S. regional partners and China, right? And the regional partners, I just don't think they're going to back down. I think they're willing to give a little bit. We've seen that with the Philippines, but but the Southeast Asian countries presumably feel, because of the World Court ruling, that they have international law on their side. The Chinese, of course, rejected that. But I mean, the sort of the broad sense, I think, in the United States at least, is that China's increasing annexation of the South China Sea is inappropriate, and the United States is going to push back. But again, the United States doesn't have to do it alone, right? You're not going to have a clash between the U.S. Navy and the PLA, and it's just not going to happen because the Americans can push locals to do it, right? And you already see countries like Australia, for example, doing freedom of navigation patrols in the South China Sea, right? And the Americans are trying to talk to India to get involved, right? I mean, there's a lot of so the more China pushes, right, the more locals are going to push back, and so the United States doesn't have to do it directly, right? I think it's highly unlikely, actually, to be a direct clash of arms between the U.S. and China, like in the next decade. I don't think that's likely.
Mm-hmm. Well, Benoit, obviously, the U.S. Would often say, the Chinese activities are unlawful. For example, the claim of South China Sea, you can say the same probably to all the claimants in a sense. And if you cite this UNCLOS, the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, if that's the rules-based order, let's follow the law of the sea and the UN Convention. But why don't the U.S. join the UNCLOS?
Well, yeah, certainly there has been increasing pressure for the United States to join UNCLOS because this kind of double game of talking about respect for the maritime law and then not being a part of UNCLOS obviously undermines its credibility in many quarters. But I think that's something that's not limited to UNCLOS. I think the United States has long been hesitant to join certain international treaties where it feels like it does not necessarily suit its interests. But in the case of UNCLOS, the official line from the United States is that it already follows, it already respects the treaty in name, even though it is not a part of UNCLOS. But certainly in this case particularly, we continue to hear some voices in the United States for the United States to join UNCLOS. But I think it's going to be a while before we see any kind of move towards an official accession to the treaty in the United States.
Mm-hmm. Well, Zhao Hai, from the Chinese perspective, Robert has said, there's very unlikely to see a direct confrontation between China and the U.S. So what do you see that?
Well, the U.S. might say that, but recently the U.S., particularly the military, is talking about their new so-called tri-service maritime strategy, which from the Chinese perspective sounds very dangerous because they want to combine military power with Coast Guard power. And when they get involved in the South China Sea from Coast Guard perspective, it is very easy to get to friction between the Chinese side and Southeast Asia countries or directly with the United States, even though it's below military conflict level. However, I mean, that could easily escalate into a higher possibility of conflict. Right now, the U.S. trying to pursue some sort of hotline between U.S. and China, trying to find a way to resolve crisis when proper. However, from Chinese perspective, it is not. It's really not authentic or sincere from American side. We want to have a more strategic trust between the two sides before we can talk about further actions, including establish hotlines between the two sides. So I think at this point, what both sides needs to do is to de-escalate in South China Sea, particularly for the U.S. to reduce its activities using this kind of new techniques or new strategy in South China Sea.
Mm-hmm. Now we bring in Professor Thintini Pongsudira. Professor Pongsudira, obviously with this intensive engagement from U.S. top officials doing, including, of course, video conferences like every day this week between Blinken and ASEAN officials over there. So what do ASEAN nations see the U.S. Recent intensive activity to call to ASEAN nation, let's say?
Well, the ASEAN foreign ministers meeting is a routine kind of annual meeting twice a year. So this 54th edition is coming up. It takes place this week. So it's not surprising ASEAN will have a meeting among its own ministers, foreign ministers, but also with the dialogue partners and so on. And it's also a teleconference. It's a video conference. So it's part of routine, part of annual exercise. But at the same time, I think tensions and issues also are contentious in the region. Apart from the South China Sea, you can see that the U.S. Senior officials have been visiting the region. I think the Deputy Secretary, Wendy Sherman, and then the Secretary of Defense, General Austin, and now with this Secretary Blinken in the video conference. So, tensions and issues are bound, and I think the ASEAN countries, ASEAN member states, they're in trouble with COVID, but also ASEAN wants to maintain its central role in organizing this architectural dialogues with the other partners. And that's why I think we have to focus on it this week.
Mm-hmm. Well, is there any sense of being pressured to choose sides, like to side with China or the U.S. on any particular issue?
The U.S., through Secretary Austin, the Defense Secretary, has said that they don't want the ASEAN to choose sides. I think China also has said the same. But I think that as the competition and rivalry between the U.S. and China intensify, ASEAN states are feeling more and more pressure, under more pressure to take different sides. Basically, I mean, if the two superpowers become more polar opposite, if their distance between them become more spacious, takes more space, they become more different, divergent, then the member states in ASEAN, smaller states, will be under more pressure. And also you have in ASEAN, more pressure from within as well. The coup in Myanmar, the Myanmar coup, I think, has divided ASEAN. I think South China Sea has also divided ASEAN. And that's why ASEAN feels a little bit insecure at this point, insecure because it is afraid of losing its own centrality in the region.
Well, speaker for the centrality, obviously, for countries in the region, they would love to see ASEAN in the driver's seat, for example, in the CPTPP or RCEP, for example, free trade zones, multilateralism in this region. If you look at that, you see increasing engagement with countries, ASEAN countries, including Singapore, Vietnam, and the Philippines. Is there a concern that those countries' close engagement somehow maybe even become part of the Quad system over there that might, long term, might divide ASEAN somehow or weaken the role of ASEAN as the central part in this region?
I think ASEAN governments and also I think among the think tanks, they feel they're concerned about the rising role of the Quad countries, US, Japan, Australia, and India, especially this potential for the Quad Plus. So you can see that apart from the senior officials, we've seen already, Sherman and Austin, but we also will see Kamala Harris, the vice president, also will visit the region, especially Vietnam. Vietnam and Singapore have come in greater focus as U.S. strategic partners and function like allies, really, almost like allies. Like Thailand's a treaty ally, but it's not very close to the U.S. In recent years. Philippines is in between. So I think ASEAN feels that the Quad potential for Quad Plus and certainly the Quad could overshadow ASEAN centrality, because ASEAN at this point is a little bit weak. It has not been able to come up with a way forward on Myanmar's coup. It cannot appoint an envoy yet. And the 5-point consensus, I think, has not been implemented yet from April 24th. So it's a time of ASEAN's insecurity and also the rising rivalry between the US and China. And this is why this year's meetings that's hosted by ASEAN are extra important at this time.
Mm-hmm. Well, Benoit, if you look at this engagement both from China and the U.S., in terms of a vaccine, for example, China has supplied more than 100 million doses of COVID-19 vaccines to ASEAN countries. The U.S. is also stepping up their efforts to provide, more than 20 million, and there's a promise to give Indonesia $30 million in COVID-19 assistance. So this kind of competition between China and the U.S. is actually good. Trying to help, which country can do more to help ASEAN countries. That kind of competition should be welcomed.
Well, as a matter of fact, this is a good point.
Okay, Benoit, please. Yeah.
Oh.
Between the US and China, in fact, I think
Benoit from Tokyo. Sorry, Professor. Yeah. Benoit, go ahead.
Yes, thank you. Sorry. Yes, indeed. If I think there's one area where this competition between the United States and China can be beneficial to the countries of the region, it is indeed with vaccine diplomacy. We have seen from the beginning of the crisis, I think China had a head start with providing more dose of the vaccine to Southeast Asian countries. But with the summit meeting of Quad in March of this year, we saw a greater drive by the Quad members, the Quad partners, to increase or boost vaccine production, especially in India. And now with this new announcement of the United States to provide more vaccines to Southeast Asia, it is certainly, I think, it's going to be beneficial for the region. Of course, it would be even more productive if China and the United States did this in a coordinated fashion. But given the heightened rivalry at the moment, even something that should be considered apolitical, like the provision of vaccines to developing countries, becomes a political issue, and it makes cooperation very difficult. But nonetheless, as you pointed out in your question, I think this kind of competition, at the end of the day, especially as opposed to other sorts of competition in the military fields or political, diplomatic field, I think this kind of competition can, in the end, benefit the 640 million people of the region.
Mm-hmm. Well, Zhao Hai, the Chinese Foreign Ministry has stressed the importance of multilateralism and to reject, quote, exclusive cliques or zero-sum games, end quote, ahead of Blinken's attendance, of these ministerial meetings with ASEAN officials over there. Obviously, from the Chinese point of view, China would love to see, I would say, instead of exclusive, should be inclusive, any kind of security framework or economic cooperation or vaccine cooperation in this region, because that will be in the benefits actually of everyone. I mean, both the U.S. and China and ASEAN countries actually prize, value peace and stability in this region, isn't it?
Yes, indeed. And I think, we've talked enough about competition between U.S. and China, and also sometimes confrontation, the danger of dividing the region. But we should also, focus more on the cooperation side, not only between the region and either China and the U.S., but also possibility of China and U.S. working together on some global challenges, including the current pandemic and also vaccination, but also other areas like climate change that this region is also facing. For this this season, we see more stronger typhoon, we see more stronger flood, and also wildfire, all kinds of severe weather conditions. The climate is seriously changing, and we need to face that challenge. And U.S. and China can work together in this area. We've worked together before during the Obama administration, so I think this is the area. And also in terms of Myanmar, we talked about that just now, and I think U.S.-China can work on that problem together as well. In many other regional and also global issues, there are spaces where the two countries can work together and improve the overall welfare of the world. And I think that's exactly what ASEAN countries would like to see moving forward.
Mm-hmm. Well, Professor, Pansu Dira, is it possible for ASEAN nations basically, to again play a leading role in asserting that the priority for ASEAN and for this region is peace and stability? Even with competition, you guys should not fight in our yard, And also, we would like to see you more cooperation in economic fields, in vaccination, in climate change. Is that possible?
There's a lot of areas that the U.S. and China can cooperate instead of compete, and it needs a kind of a mediator or some kind of a bridge to narrow the divide, the differences. ASEAN certainly can play that role. However, for ASEAN centrality to work for the ASEAN bridge and a role as a bridge and buffer and broker for closer U.S.-China cooperation, it requires ASEAN unity. And I think ASEAN, because it's been split within on a range of issues, especially the most recent being Myanmar's coup and the reactions to it. This is why ASEAN is, I think, it's not in a position to play that role at this time. But if it can bridge, if it can close that divide and see eye to eye again with some kind of compromise through this envoy and the summit that we had in April, then maybe ASEAN can regain its footing. For ASEAN centrality to work, it requires unity, and for the centrality and unity to work, ASEAN needs to come together as one and then promote more cooperation between US and China.
Mm-hmm. Well, one case of cooperation could be the Myanmar case, as some of you have mentioned earlier. ASEAN is playing a leading role, and both China and the U.S. actually have a similar expectation out of this situation in Myanmar. Benoit, is that a case for three sides to cooperate to stabilize the situation over in Myanmar?
Well, indeed, the other guests have mentioned that before, but even though the goal of both the United States and China is stability in Myanmar, especially in the case of China, given the massive investments that it has in Myanmar, so it has a very important stake in stability in this country. However, when it comes to the approach to solving this issue, I think this is where there's a little bit of daylight between China and the United States. I think the United States have been pursuing a more pressure-based approach on Myanmar, trying to get other partners to sanction Myanmar, whereas China is calling for has been much more cautious in the case of Myanmar, and is obviously not doesn't have any intention of imposing sanctions on Myanmar. So even though here we are seeing a case of a drive towards a similar goal, a common goal, the approach, and this is the case for so many regional issues, this is what personally concerns me a lot, is the methods, the ways, the means of getting to that particular end goal seems or tends to differ a lot. So this is why, even in the case of Myanmar, I am relatively skeptical of a possibility of cooperation.
Mm-hmm. Zhao Hai, do you see ASEAN playing like a bridge, a rule of bridge the gap between China and the U.S.? Any possibility? 1 minute.
Yeah, I think so. I think in many cases, the areas that I mentioned, ASEAN could play a central role and also play a bridging role between the two countries, because those countries have all stakes in the region in terms of stability and prosperity, and South China Sea is very much at the center of this issue. So when the U.S. trying to increase participation or presentation in the region, those countries should tell the U.S. to have a relatively constructive role played in the region and not to confront China in almost every area. So by cooperating with China, it's going to be beneficial to both the U.S. increasing its prominence in the region, and also good for China and ASEAN countries when they continue to increase trade and other exchanges between the two sides. So it's going to be a win-win situation. It's exactly what China is advocating right now, and I think ASEAN could and should play that role.
Well, thank you, gentlemen. That's it for today. Thanks for watching. See you next time.